Hi, everybody. It's Jay Steven here. And I got a really interesting letter from one of my Patreon supporters recently. His name is Jason. I'm going to read what Jason has to say. I enjoyed your series on the Northern Crusades. Well, thank you, Jason. After listening to it, I can't help but see the Northern Crusades as totally illegitimate. They seem to have just been a series of land grabs. The Baltic pagans were clearly in the right, merely defending themselves. Okay, Jason, well, thanks very much for the message. We did a pretty extensive series on the Northern Crusades, and we did talk a lot about, the ferocity of the campaigns to Christianize the pagan Baltic. The Teutonic Knights were rough characters. They were willing to engage in very brutal warfare to achieve their ends. But I do think we kind of do a disservice to ourselves if we divide the Northern Crusades up into, the pagans as the good guys and the Teutonic Knights as just the bad guys. History doesn't work very well that way, but also I don't think it's really consistent with reality, because the truth is that most people today, if they actually look at sort of how these pagan Baltic societies function, there's some nuance there. So to discuss this issue, I want to read a couple little passages from a really good book. This is the Teutonic, just the casual, somebody with a casual interest, or somebody who's got a deeper interest in the Teutonic Knights as well. And it's by a really great scholar, a guy by the name of William Urban, who is an expert in certain areas of Baltic studies. And I just want to read a little bit of this, and I think he's going to provide us with some good, maybe a bit of a counter perspective to what Jason has concluded here. So, because infant females were often killed soon after birth, Prussian women were scarce, and the fathers could demand a high bride price for the sale of their daughters. Nevertheless, polygamy was practiced, and a prominent noble was expected to have several wives and concubines. That made it necessary to raid neighboring lands in order to bring back women as prisoners. So, infanticide was a common practice among the pagan Prussian tribes. Okay. Prussian nobles were in many ways like nobles elsewhere. They lived by hunting and warfare, and on the labor of their slaves. The women and children they captured on raids served as household help and as concubines, but often they treated them as human merchandise in the regional slave markets. There is some evidence of a trade route south through Poland, and no one would be surprised if many captives were sold down the Russian rivers, the traditional slave route to the Turks and Byzantines. Although this eastern traffic was long past its heyday and was being interrupted by nomadic incursions into southern Russia, it was still profitable. Men were of little use as prisoners or slaves unless they could be sold immediately, because they could escape too easily while performing agricultural work in the small forest clearings. Children were even less valuable, because it was expensive to raise a child to adulthood just to work in the fields. Women were more suitable in every sense for the primitive farming in grain crops and for gathering food in the woods. Prussian nobles did not work, but lived by their own set of traditions that distinguished them from the commoners. The Christian nobles in Germany and Poland did not work either, but they did not live by the labor of slaves or the income derived from the sale of prisoners taken in warfare. The tradition of slave catching and the concept of honor that lay behind the successful Prussian social religious system were cited by Christians in Poland and Pomerania as the main reasons for their making war on the pagans in Prussia. A cynical modern observer might suggest that Christian rulers' eagerness to expand their domain was considerably more important. No matter. Either way, it appears that religion per se was not the most significant cause of the wars between the Christians and pagans along the Vistula River. Religion became important later, of course, for all parties. The Prussians, certainly once provoked, were not content to remain at home and practice their rights in peace, but were compelled by their evolving customs to continue their raids on Christian neighbors, long after they had taken revenge for the initial outrages. Clearly, it was this increasingly aggressive activity over the years, whether it started as raw warlust or as a reaction to Poland invasions, that eventually brought not just the Poles and Pomeranians, but also Germans from the distant Holy Roman Empire to make war against them. Okay, so let's read one more little passage here. Meanwhile, the Livonian branch of the order, that's the Teutonic order, was also making headway in its offensives south of the Riga. It seemed on the verge of a significant victory in 1250, when Mindaugas of Lithuania accepted Roman Christianity, thus removing the justification for attacking his lands. Although some critics of the Teutonic order see the knights as nothing more than land-hungry robbers, in this instance they gave up an opportunity to seize territories in order to make one of Christendom's greatest foes into a strong ally. Shortly thereafter, Prussian resistance began to collapse too. In 1256, King Ottokar II of Bohemia, the most powerful single ruler in the Holy Roman Empire, led to Samland an army so powerful that the local natives realized resistance was futile. Shortly afterward, in 1257, the Samogitians asked for a 2-year truce to consider their options. The Crusaders granted this request, confident that self-interest would induce their foes to make a formal acceptance of the true faith. For a moment it appeared that Christendom had triumphed totally in the Baltic region. The Crusaders' enthusiasm for peaceful conversions should give pause to those who prefer to believe that the Germans were out to depopulate the entire region and resettle it. But it's unlikely that the Teutonic Knights will be judged by the most consistent of their statements and actions, for they, like most human organizations, exhibited over time a wide range of behaviors. If one always assumes the worst of them and the best from their foes, one can see them as evil indeed. And that is the way that many historians, particularly those who judge the past as essentially part of the 20th century, have written about these German warriors. Okay, so I think that's a pretty helpful set of passages there, especially if we're looking at this issue of why did the Latin West, why was it driven to get involved in these Northern Crusades and this push into the Baltic? I think that, this issue of infanticide, the fact that infanticide was widely practiced in among these pagan Baltic tribes, and this is not unique to them, of course. Infanticide seems to be a common feature of most pagan societies throughout the world, like wherever we're looking at. But that aside, I think the point here is that sort of this trying to get this clear-cut, moral, oh, well, the Teutonic Knights were evil and wicked, the pagans were these good guys. I think that, when you look at the reality of things, like the fact that something like infanticide was commonly practiced, infant girls were frequently killed because of the nature of the society. And this is one of the things that the Christian West removed once they did conquer the region. So were there things about the Northern Crusades that resulted in an improvement in things in the region? Well, an end to the practice of infanticide might be one of them. So yeah, I just think we can't look at these pagan groups as saints. The fact is that they had an economic system. One of the things Urban is talking about there is the fact that the lifestyle of these pagan tribal nobles, kind of these chieftain groups, was such that their way of life relied on this practice of slave raids, and they made slave raids into Christian territory. This was a part of the way they supported themselves. This was a more primitive type of economic system than what existed in the feudal West. And, this is the kind of thing that provoked Latin Christendom into going after these regions and wanting to Christianize them and neutralize this threat. And the other thing, too, is I think that we have to be careful about just assuming the idea that, the religious aspect to these crusades was just some kind of pretense. Like the Teutonic Knights were simply looking for an excuse to go in there and get control of the territory. Urban, talks about how when you've got this Lithuanian ruler who's willing to convert to Christianity, the Teutonic Knights are willing to honor their idea of, okay, well, now we'll treat you as an ally because we can deal with you as another Christian power. They were willing to do that. So yeah, and this issue of like infanticide, for example, and the capturing of women for use as slaves and to sell as slaves. These were things that the papacy was aware of. The church was aware of this, and these were strong motivators for one of the reasons why they wanted to Christianize this region. So anyway, yeah, that's just a little overview of this issue. And Jason, I hope maybe this kind of helped you take some other perspectives into account. And I know I did kind of talk a lot about kind of some of these brutal putting downs of rebellions that the Teutonic Knights did during the Prussian Crusade and stuff like that. And there's no question the Teutonic Knights were absolutely willing to use some very brutal tactics. But the pagans weren't saints either. So anyway, hope this was an interesting video to everybody. Please, to help out this video, help it spread around, give it a like. And if you like what we do here with Real Crusades History, become a Patreon supporter. We do offer rewards to those who join us on Patreon. So talk to you soon.